When you picture a medieval wedding, what comes to mind? A glowing stone cathedral, a princess in a flowing white gown, a noble knight waiting at the altar. It's a beautiful image, but the real story is far more surprising. In the Middle Ages, weddings weren't just romantic celebrations. They were political alliances, family negotiations, community festivals, and sometimes surprisingly simple gatherings in front of a church door. Some couples feasted for days, others barely had a ceremony at all, and many brides didn't even wear white. Tonight, we're stepping back in time to uncover what medieval weddings actually looked like, from the clothing and vows to the food, music, traditions, and unexpected customs that shaped one of the most important days in a person's life. Were marriages really arranged? Did people marry for love? What did guests eat? And how different were royal weddings from those of ordinary villagers? If you love discovering the real stories behind popular myths, you're going to enjoy this journey. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video. It helps more history lovers find the channel. Comment below and tell me, would you rather attend a royal medieval wedding or a small village celebration? And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into the everyday realities of the past. When you're finished watching, be sure to check out our related videos exploring medieval daily life, legendary rulers, and the hidden details history books often leave out. Now, let's ring the bells, gather the guests, and step into the world of medieval weddings. Close your eyes for a moment. When you think of a medieval wedding, what do you see? A tall stone castle, sunlight pouring through stained glass, a bride in a bright white gown walking slowly down a long aisle, a handsome knight waiting at the altar, maybe a harp playing softly, maybe flower petals drifting through the air like snow. It feels romantic, clean, cinematic. It also feels suspiciously modern. Most of what we imagine about medieval weddings does not come from the Middle Ages at all. It comes from paintings made centuries later. It comes from Victorian artists. It comes from fantasy films. It comes from stories that wanted knights and princesses to fall in love under perfect light. But if we step quietly into medieval Europe between about 500 and 1500, the picture changes. It does not become ugly. It does not become cruel, but it becomes practical. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not mostly about romance. It was about stability, land, labor, alliances, survival. That does not mean love never existed. Of course it did. People were still people. They laughed, they flirted, they hoped. But love was not the foundation of the wedding. The wedding was a legal act, a social contract, a public agreement. Imagine a stone village at dawn. The air is cold. Breath shows in pale clouds. A bell rings from the parish church, not dramatically, just as it always does. Carts creak past. Chickens scatter. A wedding might happen here today, but the world does not pause for it. Bread must still be baked. Animals must still be fed. In noble households, the setting changes. A manor hall, heavy with woven tapestries, smoke curling upward from a central hearth. But even here, the wedding is not a fairy tale. It is paperwork. It is negotiation. It is witness. Hollywood shows us grand cathedrals and white silk dresses. But the white wedding dress, that is a much later invention. It became fashionable after the 19th century, especially after Queen Victoria chose white for her wedding. Medieval brides wore their best dress, whatever color that happened to be: blue, red, green, brown. The idea was not purity in fabric, it was value in cloth. And those cathedrals, many medieval weddings happened at the church door, not inside. The doorway was symbolic. It was public. It was visible to the community. Marriage was not private. It belonged to everyone who depended on it, because that is the key. Marriage was not just between two people. It was between families, between lineages, between economic units. If you lived in a peasant village, your marriage affected who farmed which strips of land, who shared tools, who inherited animals, who cared for aging parents. If you lived among the nobility, your marriage could change borders. It could secure peace. It could start wars. One wedding could redraw a map. That sounds dramatic. But most medieval weddings were quiet, ordinary, practical. There were no choreographed bridal marches, no printed invitations, no diamond engagement rings glittering under chandeliers. Diamonds were rare. Rings were simple bands, often iron or gold depending on wealth. Sometimes there was no ring at all, just words spoken clearly and witnessed. And those words mattered more than anything. In medieval canon law, the legal system of the church, mutual consent made the marriage. Two people saying, in present tense, that they took each other as husband and wife. That was powerful, sometimes too powerful. It led to secret marriages, clandestine vows whispered without parents present. The church would later try to control that. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to let go of the shining armor fantasy. Knights did not usually arrive in full battle gear for a wedding unless there was a reason to show off. Armor was expensive and uncomfortable. Most grooms wore fine tunics, hose, and cloaks appropriate to their status. A sword might hang at the side, more symbol than threat. It suggested protection, responsibility, and the bride. She was not floating down a long aisle alone while everyone turned to stare. Often she stood outside with her family, or she processed only a short distance. The ceremony was not about spectacle. It was about agreement. Agreement that property would move. Agreement that heirs would be legitimate. Agreement that households would merge. There is something almost quiet about it. Picture a wooden table inside a dim hall, a few candles, wax dripping slowly, two fathers discussing land boundaries in low voices, a mother smoothing folded linen, a priest reviewing names, no violins swelling in the background, just murmurs and the crackle of fire. That was the heart of a medieval wedding, not a performance, a negotiation with witnesses, and yet it was still a human moment. The bride may have felt nervous. The groom may have shifted his weight, aware of eyes watching. Friends may have joked. Someone may have spilled ale. Children likely fidgeted. Life, even then, refused to be perfectly solemn. We must also remember something else. Medieval Europe was not one place. A wedding in 9th century Scandinavia looked different from one in 14th century Italy. A peasant wedding in rural England was not the same as a royal wedding in France. Customs shifted over centuries. The church gained power slowly. Laws evolved. Traditions layered over older traditions. So when we ask, what did medieval weddings actually look like? The honest answer is, it depends. It depends on time. It depends on region. It depends on wealth. It depends on politics. But beneath all that variation, there is a pattern. Marriage was work. Marriage was structure. Marriage was survival. Romance could grow inside it like ivy along stone, but the stone came first. As we move forward, we will walk slowly through each stage: courtship, betrothal, dowry, clothing, ceremony, feast, even the parts people tend to whisper about. We will strip away the fairy tale gently and see what remains. And what remains is not less interesting. It is more real. A bell continues to ring in the distance. The mist does not lift quickly. Somewhere, a bride adjusts the sleeve of a dress she has worn before because it is her best one. Somewhere, a groom counts coins with careful hands. No trumpets. just the quiet turning of history. And now, we begin. If you were a young person in medieval Europe, falling in love was not usually the first step toward marriage. Sometimes it happened. Of course it did. People have always found ways to glance a little too long across a room. But love was unpredictable. Marriage could not afford to be. Marriage was planning. It was land measured carefully in narrow strips. It was livestock counted at dusk. It was alliances secured before winter. Among the nobility, marriage was strategy. A daughter might be promised to the son of another lord to secure peace between territories. A marriage could settle a dispute without bloodshed, or strengthen a claim to inheritance, or combine estates into something more powerful. A wedding could prevent a war. It could also start one, but that is another story. In noble halls, courtship often looked less like romance and more like negotiation. Families spoke first. Fathers, uncles, guardians. They discussed dowries. They discussed property. They discussed political advantage. The bride and groom might meet only briefly before the agreement was nearly settled. That sounds cold to modern ears. But remember the world they lived in. Life expectancy was uncertain. Harvests could fail. Borders were fragile. Marriage was one of the few tools families had to protect themselves. It made sense to treat it carefully. Now shift from castles to villages. In a rural community, things were simpler, but still practical. A young man might work alongside a young woman during harvest. They might talk, they might laugh. But if marriage became possible, their families would still weigh the decision. Could the couple support themselves? Was their land available? Would joining households ease labor shortages? Peasant marriages were often delayed until both individuals could reasonably maintain a home. Contrary to popular myth, most medieval brides were not children. In many regions, women married in their late teens or early 20s. Men were often slightly older, sometimes mid-20s, because they needed time to secure resources. There were exceptions, especially among royalty, but everyday people usually waited until marriage was economically viable. And here is something important. Consent mattered. By the High Middle Ages, canon law, the Church's legal framework, insisted that mutual consent between the man and woman created a valid marriage, not just parental approval, not just paperwork, the spoken agreement of the couple themselves. This created tension. Parents wanted control. The church wanted sacramental order. Young people sometimes wanted each other. There are records of couples exchanging vows privately, without parental blessing. They would simply say the words in present tense, "I take you as my husband, I take you as my wife," and by church standards, they were married. No feast, no ring required, just words. You can imagine the chaos that sometimes followed. Fathers arguing that a daughter had been tricked, families denying a promise was made, priests called to investigate whispered vows. So while courtship was rarely centered on romantic love, it was not entirely devoid of personal agency either. Medieval life was structured, but not robotic. People still found ways to act within the rules or bend them. Now let us slow the scene down. Picture a long wooden table in a manor hall. Candles flicker in iron holders. The air smells faintly of smoke and wool. Two families sit facing one another. A father clears his throat. He speaks carefully about land. A mother mentions the linens her daughter has prepared. A young man stares at the table's grain, pretending calm. A young woman folds her hands, listening to her future being discussed in steady voices. It is not cruel. It is not theatrical. It is serious. In villages, the scene might be smaller. Perhaps two households meet in a single-room cottage. A loaf of bread is shared. Ale is poured. There is less grandeur, but the weight is the same. Marriage meant another pair of working hands, another mouth to feed, another claim to inheritance. It meant survival extended into the next generation. We should also be careful not to imagine medieval parents as heartless negotiators. They were pragmatic, yes, but they also lived in the same harsh world. A bad match could ruin a daughter's security. A foolish alliance could weaken a son's position. Their caution came from experience. Sometimes affection grew after marriage. Many couples worked side by side for decades. Shared hardship can be a powerful bond. Medieval literature, especially later romances, certainly celebrated idealized love. But daily life was less poetic. Love was welcome. It just was not required. There is something oddly calming about that honesty. No pressure for fireworks. No expectation of perfection. Just two people entering a partnership that would demand labor, patience, and endurance. In noble courts, elaborate rituals might surround the negotiations. In peasant villages, discussions were quieter, but the foundation remained the same. Marriage was alliance. Marriage was contract. Marriage was social architecture. And yet, beneath the structure, there were still small human moments. A shy smile exchanged when parents looked away. A joke shared during harvest. A nervous laugh as details were finalized. Even in a world ruled by necessity, people remained human. Courtship, then, was not a grand romantic chase. It was a careful alignment of families, property, and future stability. Feelings might follow, or they might not. But either way, once an agreement began to form, the next stage was even more important. Because before there was a wedding ceremony, there was something quieter, something binding. The betrothal, long before the wedding feast, before the church bells, before the awkward dancing and the overcooked goose, there was the betrothal. In many parts of medieval Europe, this was the moment that truly mattered. The wedding ceremony might come later, weeks later, months later, sometimes even years later. But the betrothal, the promise, that was when the future shifted. It did not always look dramatic. Two people stood facing each other, often outside a church door, sometimes inside a hall, sometimes in a simple village yard with neighbors watching. They joined hands. That gesture mattered. The practice was sometimes called handfasting. The hands were clasped, often right hand to right hand. It was not decorative. It symbolized agreement, mutual consent, a bond forming in plain sight. Then came the words. In medieval canon law, tense was everything. If the couple said words in the future tense, "I will take you as my husband," that was a promise to marry later. Binding, yes, but not yet complete. If they spoke in the present tense, "I take you as my husband," that could create a valid marriage on the spot. Just like that, no orchestra, no elaborate script, just language. Words had legal weight, and witnesses were crucial. A betrothal was stronger when others heard it. Neighbors, relatives, sometimes a priest. But even without clergy, consent could carry power. This created a strange situation. The church insisted that marriage was built on mutual consent, but it also worried about secret promises. Young couples might exchange vows privately, claiming marriage afterward. Parents objected. Property disputes followed. Church courts filled with arguments over who had promised what and when. So over time, the church tried to bring order. Public betrothals, publication of bans, clear witnesses. But in earlier centuries, the system was looser, more human, and sometimes more chaotic. Now imagine the scene slowly. The morning air is cold. A small crowd gathers. The bride's veil is simple linen, not white silk, just the best she owns. The groom's tunic is brushed clean. Someone coughs softly. A priest murmurs a brief blessing. The couple joins hands. It is an ordinary motion. People join hands every day. But here, it is declaration. Often a ring was exchanged, but not always. If there was a ring, it was usually plain. Gold for the wealthy, iron or bronze for others. Diamonds were rare and not the standard symbol of engagement we know today. The ring was less about sparkle and more about continuity. A circle, no beginning, no end. In some regions, the groom placed the ring briefly on 3 fingers, invoking the Trinity, before settling it on the 4th. Symbolism layered gently into ritual, but do not imagine a dramatic kneeling proposal. That is modern theatre. The betrothal was serious, quiet, binding, and it carried consequences. Breaking a betrothal could be costly. Gifts had already been exchanged. Dowry discussions begun. Families involved. If one side withdrew without reason, disputes followed. Reputation could suffer. Lawsuits could emerge in ecclesiastical courts. In peasant communities, where survival depended on cooperation, a broken promise might damage social standing for years. Among the nobility, a broken betrothal could strain alliances, or worse. And yet, betrothals could happen very young, especially in elite circles. Children might be formally promised for political reasons, but the actual marriage, especially consummation, was typically delayed until both were older. For common people, betrothal often marked the beginning of practical preparation. A bride might begin assembling her trousseau, linens, clothing, household goods, not glamorous, but essential. She prepared not just for a ceremony, but for labor. A groom might secure land access or employment. He might negotiate tenancy. He might save coin. Marriage required economic footing. So while modern culture treats engagement as romantic suspense, a glittering prelude, medieval betrothal was functional momentum. It said, "This will happen." It signaled to the community that 2 households were aligning. It reduced uncertainty, and in a world filled with uncertainty, that mattered deeply. There is something almost steady about it. No elaborate surprise proposal, no hidden photographers, just clarity. 2 people stand before witnesses and say what they intend. The simplicity is striking. Yet simplicity did not mean softness. Families listened carefully to every word. Property arrangements were tied to these promises. Dowry agreements might be verbally confirmed during the betrothal. Livestock counted. Parcels of land described. Payments scheduled. The betrothal was the hinge on which everything swung, and sometimes it was enough. There are documented cases where couples considered themselves fully married after exchanging present-tense vows during betrothal, even if no formal church ceremony followed immediately. This blurred line between promise and marriage troubled church authorities for centuries. It forced medieval society to wrestle with a strange idea. Was marriage about ritual, or was it about consent? The answer evolved slowly, but for the couple standing hand in hand, the question was simpler. They had spoken. The future had shifted. Now imagine the moment after the words are said. The witnesses nod. Someone exhales. A mother wipes her hands on her apron. A father gives a small, approving tilt of his head. The couple releases hands. Nothing dramatic happens. The sky does not change color. The earth does not tremble. But legally, socially, economically, everything has changed. They are no longer just 2 individuals. They are a promise in motion. And from this promise flows the next essential piece of medieval marriage. Not romance, not celebration, but money. Because before the wedding feast could be imagined, there was another quiet ritual to complete, the dowry. If romance was optional in a medieval wedding, money was not. Before the feast, before the blessing, before the bells, there was the counting, coins laid carefully on wood, livestock tallied in quiet fields, chests opened to show folded linen and carefully woven cloth. Marriage was not only about two people joining, it was about resources moving. The dowry was central to this movement. In much of Western Europe, a dowry was property or wealth brought by the bride into the marriage. It might include coin, land, livestock, furniture, clothing, tools, even entire estates in noble families. It was not a payment for the groom. It was a contribution to the new household, a way to secure the bride's position, a signal that she entered marriage with material value attached. That sounds blunt. It was, but it was also protective. A substantial dowry strengthened a woman's standing. It could influence how she was treated. It provided leverage. In some regions, it ensured her maintenance if she were widowed. Now, slow the scene. A heavy wooden chest sits near the hearth. Iron bands hold it together. The lid creaks open. Inside, folded linen sheets, embroidered by hand over months or years. A wool cloak, perhaps a silver cup, a small purse of coins wrapped in cloth. These are not decorative extras. They are survival tools. Linen meant warmth. Cloth meant trade value. Coin meant flexibility. For peasant families, dowries were modest but meaningful. A cow might be transferred, a few goats, a strip of land, tools, grain. In small communities, even a modest gift required sacrifice. For noble families, dowries could be enormous. Castles changed hands, territories merged, political maps shifted quietly because of marriage contracts signed beside candlelight. Sometimes the dowry was recorded in formal documents, sealed, witnessed, stored. Other times it was agreed verbally in the presence of trusted members of the community. But the dowry was only one half of the equation. There was also the dower. The dower was different. It was the portion of the husband's property set aside to support the wife if she became a widow. This mattered greatly. Medieval life was unpredictable. War, disease, accidents, all common. Without dower rights, a widow could be left vulnerable. So during negotiations, families discussed both sides. What does the bride bring? What protection does she receive? This balance was not sentimental. It was strategic. In some regions, especially outside parts of Western Europe, traditions closer to bride price appeared. Instead of the bride's family giving wealth to the groom's household, the groom or his family transferred goods to the bride's family. This system acknowledged the loss of a daughter's labor. In agricultural societies, that labor mattered deeply. A daughter was not symbolic. She was productive. Marriage shifted economic power in tangible ways. Imagine a small medieval village. A father counts 2 sheep in the dusk light. They will be part of his daughter's dowry. He hesitates slightly before agreeing. Those sheep produce wool. Wool becomes cloth. Cloth becomes trade. But marriage requires compromise. Inside, his daughter finishes spinning thread. She is prepared for this for years. Every woven cloth piece is quiet proof of readiness. It is not glamorous, but it is deeply intentional. In noble halls, the tone is different, but the logic is the same. Land parcels are described carefully, borders traced in ink, rights to mills or forests specified. Marriage contracts become legal instruments that lawyers, or their medieval equivalents, examine closely. Sometimes these agreements were written in Latin, sometimes in vernacular languages, but always with clarity, because disputes could arise later. If a husband died, how much did the widow control? If the marriage produced no children, who inherited? If a dowry was promised but not delivered, could the marriage be challenged? Church courts and secular courts alike handled such cases. Money and marriage were tightly woven together, and yet, within this financial structure, there was something steadying. The dowry represented preparation. A young woman did not enter marriage empty-handed. She carried the visible evidence of years of work, embroidery stitched by candlelight, linens washed and folded, goods saved patiently. The dowry chest itself became symbolic. It was often one of the bride's most personal possessions, decorated sometimes with carvings, carried to her new home, placed at the foot of her bed. Inside it were not just objects, there were hours, seasons, care. For the groom's family, accepting the dowry meant accepting responsibility. It meant incorporating her property into the household economy. It meant acknowledging her value beyond sentiment. This is important. Medieval society was patriarchal. Yes, legal authority leaned toward men. Yes, but women were not invisible. Their economic contributions were real. Their dowries were negotiated seriously. Their dower rights were documented carefully. Marriage was unequal, but it was structured, and structure, in a world of uncertainty, brought a kind of calm. Now imagine the final moment of agreement. The coins are counted, the sheep inspected, the chest closed again. Heads nod slowly across the table. The air feels heavy, but settled. The marriage is not yet celebrated, but it is secured. In modern weddings, budgets revolve around flowers and photography. In medieval weddings, budgets revolved around land and livestock. No floral centerpieces, no catering contracts, just survival mathematics. And once the financial groundwork was laid, attention could turn to something more visible. Not love, not yet, but cloth. Because what the bride wore mattered not for fashion, but for status. And contrary to everything fairy tales taught us, it was almost never white. Let us clear something up gently. The medieval bride did not walk down the aisle in a white wedding dress. Not ivory, not lace, not a cloud of silk. White as a standard bridal color is largely a 19th century fashion choice. In the Middle Ages, white fabric was difficult to keep clean and impractical for everyday life, and practicality was always nearby. A medieval bride wore her best dress. That is it. Her finest gown, the richest fabric she owned. The color that showed status, not innocence. Blue was common and admired. Deep reds and greens appeared among wealthier women. Browns and earth tones were frequent in peasant communities. The shade depended on dye availability and cost. Rich, vibrant dyes were expensive. Some colors signaled privilege. Clothing spoke. It said, "This family has resources." It said, "This bride brings value." It said, "We are stable." Now imagine her dressing slowly in the morning. First, the linen shift a soft underlayer worn against the skin. Linen was breathable, washable, practical. Over this came the kirtle or gown, fitted and laced. Sleeves could be snug or flowing depending on fashion and era. The fabric might be wool for most women, silk for the very wealthy. Wool does not sound glamorous to modern ears, but medieval wool could be fine, carefully woven, warm and beautiful in its own way. It draped heavily. It held dye well. It lasted. The gown was not purchased for one day. It would be worn again and again, possibly altered over time. A wedding dress was not preserved in a box for future nostalgia. It returned to daily life. This is important. Medieval weddings were not about spectacle consumption. They were about durability. Now picture her hands smoothing the fabric, the weight of embroidered hems, perhaps a simple decorative trim stitched over many evenings, maybe tiny patterns worked into the cuffs. Embroidery was labor-intensive. Even small details represented hours of focus by candlelight. If her family could afford it, she might wear a girdle, a belt around the waist. Sometimes decorated belts could carry symbolic meaning, representing fertility or marital transition. And then, the veils were common for married women in many regions. Covering the hair signaled modesty and status. The bridal veil was not necessarily white or elaborate. It could be simple linen. It could be sheer, if wealth allowed. It might be secured with pins or a circlet. The circlet, a simple metal band worn around the head, sometimes gold among nobility, sometimes bronze or decorated wire. Floral wreaths also appeared in some areas, especially in rural settings. Fresh greenery woven together, herbs, flowers in season, no plastic tiaras, no glittering rhinestones, just metal, leaves, or cloth. In elite weddings, clothing could become much more elaborate. Silk imported from distant regions, velvet, fur trim in colder climates, sumptuary laws, rules regulating what people could wear, often restricted certain fabrics and colors to specific classes. You could not simply dress like a noble if you were not one. Clothing was regulated because it communicated hierarchy. At a wedding, that hierarchy was on display. Now let us pause in a small village cottage. The bride stands near a narrow window. Light falls softly across her sleeve. Her gown is dark blue, carefully dyed with woad. It is not bright, it is deep, rich in its own quiet way. Her mother adjusts the lacing at the back. A friend smooths the veil. Someone jokes nervously about tripping on the hem. There is a brief laugh. This is not theatrical, it is intimate. And remember, this dress may have been worn before, perhaps at church, perhaps at a harvest festival, perhaps inherited and altered. Clothing in the medieval world carried history. Fabric was expensive, nothing was wasted. Garments were patched, reshaped, handed down. So the wedding gown was not a costume for a single performance. It was a working garment elevated for an important day. Even noble brides often reused their dresses after marriage. The idea of a one-time outfit would have seemed extravagant. There is something calming about that. No pressure for perfection. No panic about trends. Just the best you have. We should also mention something subtle. Medieval beauty standards were different. Pale skin was admired among the elite, signaling that a woman did not labor in fields. Long sleeves covered arms. Hair was often braided and concealed once married. The transition from uncovered maidenhair to veiled wife carried symbolic weight. Clothing marked change. When the bride left her family's home, she did not just change her dress, she changed status. Her dress, veil, and belt were part of that shift. And yet, despite all the symbolism, the garments were grounded in practicality. They had to survive cold winters. They had to endure washing. They had to last. No dry cleaning appointments. No preservation boxes. Just wool, linen, thread, and time. As she steps toward the church door or stands in the manor hall, her gown moves heavily around her ankles, not floating, not shimmering dramatically, simply present. And somewhere nearby, the groom is dressing too, not in shining armor, unless he wants to be uncomfortable all day, but in something equally symbolic, something that says protection, authority, and responsibility, because what the groom wore mattered as well. If you imagine a medieval wedding taking place deep inside a vast cathedral, light pouring through stained glass, you are not entirely wrong, but you are not entirely right either. For much of the Middle Ages, the most important part of the wedding did not happen inside the church. It happened at the door. The church porch, the threshold, was often the official location of the vows. This space was public, visible, accessible. Anyone could witness what was being said, and that visibility mattered. Marriage was not a private exchange of feelings. It was a public declaration of status. The community needed to see it, hear it, remember it. Now imagine the morning. Mist clings low to the ground. The stone church rises from the village center, solid and weathered. Its wooden door stands open. Not grand, just open. The bride and groom stand at the entrance. The priest faces them. Villagers gather in a loose half-circle. Some whisper, some shift from foot to foot in the chill air. The church door frames the moment. Inside is sacred space. Outside is the everyday world. The couple stands between. Symbolically, it is powerful. They are crossing from one life stage to another, from unmarried individuals into a recognized household. In earlier centuries, especially before the church standardized marriage practices more strictly, ceremonies could happen outdoors entirely, in courtyards, in manor halls, even in fields if necessary. What mattered most was consent and witnesses. Over time, especially by the High Middle Ages, the church strengthened its authority over marriage. The ceremony became more structured. Priests took more formal roles. But even then, the doorway tradition persisted in many places. Why not inside? Because marriage had legal implications beyond purely religious ones. It involved property, inheritance, social order. Conducting the consent portion at the threshold emphasized its public and contractual nature. Only after the vows were exchanged might the couple move inside for a nuptial mass, depending on region and era. Let us slow the scene further. The priest holds a small book. Latin words are spoken softly. The couple repeats phrases carefully. The ring, if there is one, is blessed. There is no "I'll walk" with music swelling. No dramatic pause for applause. Instead, there is steadiness. A rooster might crow nearby. A dog might bark. A cart could roll past in the distance. Life continues, and yet, within this ordinariness, something significant happens. Witnesses matter deeply here. Medieval communities relied on memory as much as documentation. If later disputes arose about dowry payments, legitimacy of children, inheritance rights, people would recall who stood at that door and what was said. The village itself functioned as a living archive. Now shift to a noble wedding. The setting may be more elaborate. A large parish church, a private chapel within a castle, tapestries hanging along stone walls, candles multiplied. But even here, the public nature remains. Important guests attend. Political allies observe. The visibility of the union reinforces alliances. Marriage is being performed not only for God, but for society, and sometimes, if circumstances demanded it, during war, travel, or emergency weddings occurred in improvised spaces. A camp chapel, a temporary altar. The church allowed flexibility when needed, though formal procedures were preferred. This adaptability reminds us again, medieval weddings were practical. No destination wedding planning, no 12-month venue deposits, no floral contracts negotiated in advance. Just a space that could host witnesses and sacred words. Now imagine the sound, wind brushing along stone, footsteps echoing softly in the porch, the priest's voice steady and measured. A brief pause between vows. The bride adjusts her veil as it shifts in the breeze. The groom clears his throat quietly. It is not theatrical. It is grounded. And once the consent is spoken at the threshold, the couple may step inside for the blessing. Crossing the doorway now feels different. They enter not as individuals negotiating a contract, but as a recognized pair. Inside the church, the atmosphere changes. Candlelight glows against stone. The smell of incense lingers faintly. The Mass, if performed, weaves the marriage into the broader rhythm of Christian worship. But remember, the heart of the marriage was already formed at the door. That is where consent was made visible, and visibility meant legitimacy. As the Middle Ages progressed, the Church tightened its involvement in marriage rituals. Informal exchanges became regulated, secret vows discouraged, public announcements required. The ceremony became less flexible, but the threshold remained symbolic, a quiet reminder that marriage stood at the intersection of sacred and social life. Outside, the village waits. Inside, blessings are spoken, and once those blessings conclude, the ceremony itself unfolds in a series of simple, deliberate steps. No elaborate choreography, no 10-part wedding program, just a calm sequence that transforms two names into one household. Let us walk through it carefully next. At first, marriage in medieval Europe was simple. Two people spoke consent. Witnesses heard it. The union stood, but simplicity can create problems. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the Church began to tighten its grip on marriage, not because romance worried them, but because confusion did. Secret vows, disputed promises, arguments over inheritance. If two teenagers whispered present-tense vows in a field, were they married? According to earlier interpretations of canon law, possibly yes. This made parents uneasy. It made property law messy. It made legitimacy hard to prove. So the Church moved carefully, steadily, toward regulation. Marriage became more formally recognized as a sacrament, not just a social contract, not just a legal bond, but a sacred union, blessed and overseen by clergy. This shift did not happen overnight. Medieval history rarely moves that cleanly. It was gradual, debated, refined through councils and legal texts. But by the High Middle Ages, certain expectations were clear. Marriage should be public. Marriage should be witnessed. Marriage should involve a priest. And before the ceremony even happened, something else was required. The publication of bans meant announcing the upcoming marriage publicly, usually on 3 consecutive Sundays during church service. The priest would declare the names of the couple and ask if anyone knew of any impediments. Impediments might include close blood relation, prior vows, existing marriage, or other canonical barriers. This was medieval background checking, not romantic, very practical. If someone stood up and objected, perhaps claiming the groom had already promised himself elsewhere, the wedding could be halted until the matter was resolved. Again, this was about order. The church courts became deeply involved in marriage disputes. They examined claims of clandestine vows. They assessed whether consent had truly been given. They investigated impotence claims in annulment cases. Yes, medieval marriage law could become extremely detailed, because marriage shaped society's structure. It determined inheritance lines. It defined legitimacy of children. It stabilized property systems. Now imagine a parish priest in the 14th century. He stands before his congregation, a small book open in his hands. He reads aloud the names of a couple intending to marry. Villagers listen. Some nod approvingly. Others exchange glances. The community participates in regulating marriage. It is not only personal, it belongs to everyone. The priest's role during the ceremony also expanded. Earlier, his presence might have been helpful but not strictly required for validity. Over time, his blessing became central. The nuptial mass, when included, embedded the marriage within liturgy. Latin prayers flowed over the couple. Blessings invoked fertility, faithfulness, unity. The ring might be sprinkled with holy water. Still, the Church maintained an interesting position on consent. Even as it strengthened procedural oversight, it never abandoned the principle that mutual consent made marriage. Not parental command, not forced arrangement, not mere cohabitation. Consent remained foundational. This created tension in cases of coercion. If a woman claimed she was forced to speak vows, the church courts sometimes examined her case carefully. Outcomes varied, but the principle existed. Marriage was serious enough to require scrutiny. And yet, despite increasing regulation, the ceremony itself remained relatively simple compared to modern standards. No elaborate wedding planning industry, no standardized decor themes, no curated guest experiences. Instead, there was structure. The couple approached the church door. They exchanged consent. The priest confirmed. The community witnessed. A blessing followed. Order restored. There is something almost calming about the church's involvement, not because it removed complexity, it often added paperwork, but because it reduced ambiguity. In a world without centralized civil registries, the parish church served as a stable record-keeper. Priests began keeping marriage registers in later centuries. Documentation became more consistent. Marriage moved from whispered possibility to documented fact, and this mattered especially during turbulent times. War could scatter families. Plague could erase generations. Clear marital status protected widows, protected children, protected land claims. So while modern audiences sometimes view medieval church control as oppressive, it also provided legal clarity in an unstable world. Now imagine the ceremony unfolding under this structured system. The priest stands steady. The couple responds carefully. The community observes quietly. The air smells faintly of wax and incense. No dramatic speeches from friends. No personalized vows. No slideshow presentations. Just words that have been spoken for generations. And after these words, the ceremony moves into its final sequence, a calm progression that seals the union, step by step, without spectacle. Let us walk through those steps next. Now we arrive at the heart of it, not the feast, not the music, not the bedding jokes, whispered by cousins. The ceremony itself. Despite everything we have discussed, dowries, negotiations, church authority, the actual wedding ritual was surprisingly simple. Let us walk through it slowly. First, the gathering. The bride and groom stand at the church door or just inside. Family surrounds them. Neighbors linger close enough to hear. The priest positions himself facing the couple. There is no aisle procession timed to music. No bridesmaids in matching dresses. No best man holding rings in a velvet box. Just people. Then comes the question. The priest may ask whether they come freely, whether they intend lawful marriage. In earlier centuries, the language might vary, but the goal is the same, to confirm consent. And then, the most important moment, the exchange of consent. The words are not poetic, they are not customized, they are direct. I take you, in the name of God, to be my wife, to be my husband. Present tense. This is crucial. Medieval canon law emphasized that consent in the present created marriage, not a promise for tomorrow, not an intention for the future, but a declaration now. The couple joins hands, hand to hand. Sometimes the priest wraps a stole around their hands briefly, a symbolic binding. In some regions, he places his right hand over theirs, sealing the gesture. It is quiet. You might hear a cough, the rustle of fabric, the distant sound of wind against stone. But socially, legally, the marriage is now made. Next, the ring. If a ring is part of the ceremony, and by the later Middle Ages it often was, the priest blesses it first. He may dip it in holy water. He may trace a sign of the cross over it. The groom then places it on the bride's finger. In some traditions, he touches the ring to 3 fingers before settling it on the 4th, invoking the Trinity. It is deliberate, slow. There is no dramatic gasping from the crowd, just attention. The ring is not a diamond showpiece. It is a band, gold if wealth allows, iron or bronze otherwise. Simple, durable. The symbol is permanence. After this, in many cases, the couple moves further inside the church for the nuptial mass. Not all medieval weddings included a full mass. It depended on era and circumstance. But when it occurred, it folded the marriage into the rhythm of Christian worship. Scripture readings, prayers, a blessing over the couple. They may kneel side by side. The priest speaks words asking for fertility, unity, peace within the household. The congregation listens quietly. There is no dramatic kiss at the end. That familiar cinematic moment did not anchor medieval ceremonies. Physical affection in public was restrained. The completion of vows was marked by blessing, not applause. Finally, the priest pronounces them married, not in the exact phrasing modern audiences expect, but in a clear acknowledgement of the union. The community recognizes it, and that recognition matters as much as the priest's words, because marriage in the Middle Ages was social architecture. It needed communal acceptance to function properly. Now, let us slow the image further. The bride's veil shifts slightly as she turns her head. The groom adjusts his stance. A candle flickers against the stone wall. The smell of incense lingers faintly. No confetti, no recessional music, no photographer shouting instructions, just stillness. The ceremony does not stretch for hours. It is structured but not extravagant. Most of the energy of the day lies ahead in the feast, in the gathering, in the public celebration. The ritual itself is focused. Consent, witness, blessing. That is the core. It is easy to imagine medieval weddings as chaotic or overly dramatic, but in truth, the ceremony portion was restrained, almost minimalist, and that restraint feels oddly soothing. No towering expectations, no choreographed perfection, just a few clear steps followed carefully. Once the final blessing is spoken, the atmosphere shifts subtly. The legal work is done. The sacred words have been said. Now the social world takes over. People exhale. Conversations begin. Someone smiles. A child fidgets impatiently because outside the church door or waiting in the manor hall, something far livelier is prepared. The feast. And unlike the ceremony, the feast could be loud, long, and deeply revealing about status and wealth. Let us step into the hall and see what was placed on the table. Ah, the feast, the part most people remember from stories. And yes, it could be glorious or, depending on your status, modest but meaningful. After vows were spoken and blessings given, the wedding shifted from ritual to celebration. It was time to eat, drink, and make the social bonds visible. In noble households, the wedding feast could last for days. Banquet halls filled with long tables, guests seated according to hierarchy, a careful display of who mattered. The best meats were served first, sometimes whole roasted pigs, geese, or even swans if you were very wealthy. Bread and ale flowed freely. Wine might appear for the elite. Dishes were often elaborately spiced, showing both wealth and access to trade networks. Imagine the smell: roasting meat, wood smoke, fresh bread, and strong ale. The flicker of torchlight along stone walls, music from fiddles, pipes, or drums filling the air. It was as much about signaling status as enjoying food. Seating mattered. Nobility at the high table, children and servants at lower tables. Courtiers might exchange polite conversation, subtle jokes, or quiet rivalries over who had more influence. Social order was on display alongside roast meats. For peasants, the feast was simpler but no less important. It often took place in the village hall or an open field with wooden benches and tables. Bread, cheese, pottage, and perhaps a bit of meat if available. Ale or watered wine flowed freely. Everyone pitched in to prepare, cook, and serve. Community participation reinforced bonds and marked the transition of the bride and groom into a recognized household. Food aside, music and dance played a key role. Musicians could be hired. Fiddlers, pipers, drummers, or friends could provide their own instruments. Dances were often group-oriented, not the modern slow dance, but lively reels and country dances. The focus was on participation, not performance. There were rituals embedded in the feast too. Toasts were given for fertility, for prosperity, for loyalty among families. Guests might throw grains or herbs over the couple, symbolic of abundance and protection from evil. Laughter and storytelling filled the gaps between bites and sips. Unlike modern weddings, there was no strict schedule for courses or speeches. People came and went, ate when food was ready, and drank as the ale or wine lasted. The feast was flexible, communal, and noisy. Yet even in this rowdy environment, hierarchy remained crucial. Nobles oversaw proceedings, ensuring proper respect was given. Peasants made sure the bread didn't burn. The bride and groom themselves might hardly sit down, moving between tables, greeting relatives, ensuring everyone felt included. For many, the feast was the first real time to see the bride and groom together in public as a married pair. They were celebrated, admired, and gently scrutinized. Appearance mattered, not just clothing, but demeanor, poise, courtesy, and adherence to custom all contributed to the impression of a competent new household. Feasts could last hours or even days in noble courts. Guests were fed in shifts, music repeated in cycles, and stories retold. For the common people, feasts might be shorter, but no less meaningful. Shared laughter, communal eating, and public recognition of the new household. And amidst all the noise, food, and laughter, there was an undercurrent of duty. The couple's new life together had begun. The feast was a celebration, yes, but it was also a public acknowledgement that their union was real, binding, and recognized by society. For the modern mind, the image of a wedding feast might conjure grandeur or romance, but the medieval feast was a mix of practicality, display, and joy. Bread and roasted meat, ale and wine, fiddles and drums, all serving the purpose of binding to families in a community together. And after the last bite, the last toast, and the music's fading echo, another part of the wedding awaited, far quieter, far more intimate, but no less significant: the bedding ceremony and consummation. Here we arrive at a chapter that often sparks curiosity and sometimes giggles in modern audiences, but it was taken very seriously in the Middle Ages. The bedding ceremony was not about romance or scandal. It was about legality, social recognition, and inheritance. In noble households especially, it confirmed that the marriage could be consummated, securing the union for property, heirs, and family alliances. The ceremony was public in its own discreet way. Yes, the bride and groom were escorted to the marital chamber, sometimes literally carried by attendants, but trusted witnesses, usually older relatives or servants, often observed symbolic gestures. Their presence ensured that no future disputes could challenge the marriage. In some regions, the witnesses would check that the couple entered the bedchamber together and that the curtains were drawn. That was the extent of the observation. Nothing graphic, nothing intended to violate modesty. It was about documentation and legitimacy. The act of consummation itself, entering the bed as husband and wife, carried enormous legal weight. Medieval canon law made the marriage binding in perpetuity only after consent and consummation. If a marriage was not consummated, annulments could be possible under certain circumstances. For the bride and groom, this could be awkward, but it was also a societal expectation. Families organized and oversaw the ritual carefully. In a noble household, the lord or lady might be present at the room's threshold, ensuring propriety, while servants or matrons managed the details inside. In peasant households, the practice was less formal but still observed within the community's gaze. Timing varied. Some ceremonies happened immediately after the feast. Others were scheduled later, after travel or other preparations. What mattered most was that the union be recognized, witnessed, and consummated, thereby securing the transfer of dowry, dower, and inheritance rights. Importantly, medieval sources describe the bedding ceremony with an air of ritual solemnity rather than eroticism. It was framed as the final step in the legal and social transition of two individuals into a married household. Symbolic gestures mattered: drawing of curtains, placement of the couple together in the bed, and the confirmation by witnesses that all was proper. Humor was not absent. Chroniclers occasionally note teasing and gentle jokes from attendants, a reminder that even in formal settings, human nature and nerves play a role. But the core purpose was legal and social, not entertainment. The ritual reflects medieval pragmatism. Marriage was a system of alliances, property, and survival. Love could exist, yes, but it was optional. Securing the household line, legitimizing children, and confirming agreements were far more pressing. For the bride, the ceremony marked the transition from daughter to wife, from one household to another. Her responsibilities, authority, and social role shifted immediately. For the groom, the ceremony confirmed his new authority, duties, and obligations. The symbolism was reinforced quietly: curtains drawn, bed prepared with care, attendants observing decorum. The act itself unites legal, social, and religious dimensions of marriage into one moment. After this step, the marriage was fully recognized. The couple could be addressed as husband and wife. Dowries were formally incorporated. Rights to property and inheritance were confirmed. The household could function fully. It is important to note, the bedding ceremony was far more common among nobility and wealthier households. Peasant marriages were often less formal. Consummation might happen privately without witnesses. The principle remained: marriage needed recognition and legitimacy, but the scale and formality varied by class. And speaking of class differences, that brings us to the next chapter, contrasting peasant weddings with noble weddings, showing how wealth and social rank shaped every detail, from clothing to feasts to ceremonies. Not all medieval weddings were created equal. In fact, they could feel like completely different worlds depending on social class. Let's start with peasant weddings. A peasant wedding was practical, communal, and deeply rooted in the local village. The bride and groom dressed in their best, often worn but mended garments, linen or wool tunics, aprons, simple belts, nothing flashy, but every stitch mattered. Appearance was a mark of respect for the occasion. The ceremony often took place at the local parish church, sometimes at the door, sometimes inside, with neighbors and family standing close. Consent, witnesses, and the blessing were essential, but simplicity prevailed. Then came the feast. It was modest: bread, cheese, pottage, maybe a small roast if the family could manage. Ale flowed generously. Everyone in the village helped prepare, cook, and serve. Guests often brought contributions: eggs, butter, or a small piglet. Music and dance were part of the celebration, played on fiddles, flutes, or homemade instruments. Reels, simple dances, and group circle dances kept the energy lively. The charm of a peasant wedding lay in participation. The community mattered. Every guest's presence reinforced the social bond. It wasn't about spectacle, it was about togetherness. Now contrast that with noble weddings. Noble weddings were political as much as they were personal. Alliances, land, and status were on display. Clothing was lavish. Gowns lined with silk or fur, tunics embroidered with gold, and elaborate cloaks signaled wealth and influence. Sumptuary laws strictly governed who could wear what. The ceremony might occur in a grand cathedral or private chapel, often followed by a nuptial mass. Witnesses included important relatives, allies, and sometimes royalty. Every gesture was observed, recorded, and remembered. The feast was an exhibition. Multiple courses, roasted meats, exotic spices, imported wine, and extended entertainment filled the hall. Seating was hierarchical, with high tables for the family and lower tables for less important guests. Musicians, jesters, and dancers performed to demonstrate sophistication and wealth. The scale could span days, yet, despite the differences, both peasant and noble weddings shared key principles: consent, community recognition, and the blending of households. Even in the grandest hall or the humblest cottage, the social and legal weight of marriage was the same. One small but telling difference: the financial burden. For peasants, organizing a wedding could strain the family's resources. Livestock might be sold, grain reserved, or debts incurred. For nobles, lavish spending showcased wealth, but also reinforced alliances. In both cases, marriage was an investment. Music, laughter, and movement marked the transition of the couple into their new roles, but the tone reflected class. Peasants emphasized practicality and shared effort. Nobles emphasized display and hierarchy. Both, however, ended with the same underlying truth. Marriage was a household, a legal unit, and a social contract. Feasts, dancing, and ceremonies were the wrapping. The purpose, union, survival, and continuity remained central. In short, medieval weddings were diverse. Social rank determined scale, attire, and extravagance, but the core principles remained remarkably consistent across classes. Next, we will explore regional differences across Europe, how customs, dress, feasts, and legal practices varied from England to Scandinavia to Iberia. Medieval Europe was not a single, uniform culture. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, counties, and villages, each with its own customs, legal traditions, and wedding practices. To truly understand medieval weddings, we need to travel across regions: England, France, German lands, Italy, Scandinavia, and Iberia, and see how geography, politics, and culture shaped the way people married. England. In England, medieval weddings were heavily influenced by both the church and local customs. By the 12th century, the church had begun to standardize marriage practices, but traditions remained rooted in the village community. Consent was always central. A couple needed witnesses, usually family members or neighbors, and a priest's blessing. Banns were often read aloud in the parish church for 3 consecutive Sundays to ensure no one objected due to prior commitments, consanguinity, or other impediments. Feasts varied by class. Noble weddings were held in great halls or cathedrals, with roasted meats, pies, spiced wine, and imported delicacies, signaling wealth and influence. Music was provided by minstrels, fiddlers, and even harpists. The seating arrangement was carefully planned. family at the high table, friends and allies at lower tables, and servants at the edges. The public witnessed both the union and the display of social order. For peasants, English weddings were more modest but equally community-focused. A village hall or open field might serve as the feast location. Ale, bread, cheese, and pottage were the staples. Villagers contributed food, labor, and musical entertainment, often involving folk songs and dances. The focus was participation, celebration, and communal support, rather than pomp or spectacle. France. Across the Channel in France, weddings were deeply entwined with regional legal traditions. Among the nobility, marriages were strategic, designed to consolidate power, land, and influence. Dowries were often substantial, including land, livestock, and movable wealth, while the bride's dower rights ensured her protection if widowed. French noble brides might wear luxurious fabrics, including silk or velvet, often dyed deep red or blue, adorned with embroidery, and sometimes accented with fur. The groom's attire mirrored this luxury. Tunics and hose of rich colors, ceremonial cloaks, and a sword symbolizing authority. Public ceremonies often took place in cathedrals or abbeys, emphasizing both religious and social legitimacy. For peasants in France, weddings were practical, emphasizing local custom. They might include throwing grains or herbs to symbolize fertility and prosperity, a tradition reflecting the agrarian rhythm of village life. Feasts relied on what the family could provide: bread, cheese, ale, and perhaps a roasted animal if available. Music often came from simple flutes, fiddles, or communal singing. Even here, the wedding marked the transition of the bride and groom into recognized household units. German lands. In the Germanic regions, including the Holy Roman Empire, weddings were similarly structured around legal and social recognition. Germanic law often emphasized formal consent and witnesses, while local customs shaped the specific rituals. Noble weddings could be elaborate, with extended feasts, multiple witnesses, and detailed legal documentation. Heraldic displays were common, especially in marriages uniting powerful families. Music included a combination of court minstrels and instrumental ensembles, with dancing reflecting both local traditions and imported styles. Among commoners, weddings often combined church rituals with local folk practices. The bedding ceremony was sometimes more symbolic than formal, with neighbors acting as witnesses. Peasant feasts included hearty local foods, bread, cheese, smoked meats, and ale, and dances like the Reigen, a circular group dance, were common. Community involvement was crucial, as marriages reinforced social cohesion in villages spread across the often fragmented Germanic territories. In Italy, the picture changes again. Italian weddings varied dramatically between city-states like Florence, Venice, and rural areas. Among the elite, marriage was both a political and economic event. Dowries could include significant property, cash, or artistic commissions. Families sought alliances with wealthy or influential households, often arranging marriages well in advance. Ceremonies were frequently held in churches or private chapels, with witnesses and priests officiating. Italian brides often wore richly colored gowns, embroidered silk, and elaborate headpieces, sometimes veiled with fine linen. Grooms displayed wealth through their tunics, cloaks, and swords. Music, banquets, and dances were a spectacle, sometimes lasting several days in urban centers. In rural Italy, weddings leaned toward practicality. Feasts centered on locally available foods: bread, pasta, cheese, cured meats, and wine. Music might be performed by local musicians or guests themselves, and dances were communal. the focus remained on consent, dowry arrangements, and public acknowledgement of the new household. Scandinavia. In Scandinavia, colder climates and rural lifestyles shaped wedding practices differently. Many ceremonies occurred indoors due to weather, often in longhouses or small parish churches. The church exerted growing influence, but local customs remained strong, especially in remote regions. Dowries often included livestock, land rights, and household goods. Clothing was practical, with heavy wool gowns and cloaks to ward off the cold, though wealthier families could afford furs and decorative embroidery. Weddings included feasts, with ale, smoked fish, bread, and hearty meats. Music and dancing were integral, often reflecting Norse folk traditions. Symbolic practices abounded. Couples might exchange tokens or perform rituals to ensure fertility and protection from evil spirits. Witnesses were essential for legal recognition, and the bedding ceremony, where practiced, was observed in a restrained, symbolic manner. Iberia. In the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain and Portugal, weddings reflected a blend of Christian, Muslim, and local customs. Nobility often arranged marriages for political and religious alliances, sometimes crossing cultural lines. Dowries and dower rights were critical, and marriages were carefully documented. Bridal attire included vibrant colors and fabrics, sometimes combining regional patterns and motifs. Grooms wore tunics and cloaks reflecting status. Public ceremonies often took place in parish churches or castles, with witnesses confirming consent. Peasant weddings in Iberia were simpler but followed the same essential principles: public acknowledgement, community involvement, and feasts featuring bread, cheese, legumes, and local wines. Music, dance, and small symbolic rituals, like throwing grains or herbs, reinforced the union. Common themes across Europe. Despite regional differences, some common threads ran throughout medieval Europe: consent and witnesses across every region. The presence of witnesses and the couple's free consent were critical. The Church's growing oversight formalized these principles, but local practice remained vital. Dowry and dower economic arrangements underpinned weddings. Whether through land, livestock, or money, the financial aspect was essential to protecting the bride and securing household stability. Feast and celebration, meals and festivities reinforced social bonds, displayed status, and marked the community's acknowledgement of the new household. The scale and extravagance varied widely, but the principle was universal. Ceremony, location, from church porches to private chapels, weddings were both public and sacred. Visibility ensured legal and social recognition. Symbolism and rituals, veils, rings, bedding ceremonies, and gestures were carefully observed to signify marital status, legitimacy, and household responsibility. In all cases, weddings balanced practicality with tradition. They reflected social order, legal necessity, economic considerations, and human life's uncertainties. While the details, clothing, food, music, and ritual shifted from England to Iberia, the underlying purpose remained consistent. Marriage united families, secured households, and ensured continuity in a world where survival was never guaranteed. Walking across Europe, you notice how culture shapes expression. The feast in Florence dazzled with silk and spices. A village in Scandinavia celebrated with hearty ale and communal dance. A German noble wedding paraded heraldry and legal formalities, yet each, in its own way, emphasized the same core elements: consent, community, and continuity. In this way, medieval weddings were simultaneously local and universal. They were rooted in place, climate, and law, yet everywhere they told the same story. Life continues, households form, and society endures. While the church shaped the formal framework of medieval weddings, the people themselves brought another layer: superstition, ritual, and folk belief. For many, the sacred ceremony and legal obligations were essential, but luck, protection, and fertility were just as important, perhaps even more pressing in a world where life was unpredictable, death often sudden, and survival uncertain. Medieval Europeans were highly superstitious by modern standards. Marriage, as a pivotal life transition, attracted countless customs designed to protect the couple and ensure prosperity. These customs varied widely between regions and classes, but certain themes recurred: safeguarding against evil, promoting fertility, and securing social harmony. One of the most common practices was the throwing of grains, herbs, or seeds. Guests at both noble and peasant weddings might scatter wheat, barley, or oats as the bride and groom left the ceremony or approached their feast. This act symbolized abundance and fertility. Wheat, in particular, was associated with growth and continuity, a hope that the couple would produce children who would carry on the family line. Sometimes herbs like rosemary or rue were added for protection, their scent believed to ward off evil spirits or misfortune. Floral wreaths and garlands were another widespread custom. Brides often wore headpieces crafted from fresh flowers, herbs, and sometimes small symbolic charms. Flowers symbolized beauty, vitality, and hope. Herbs like basil or thyme offered protective qualities. Guests might adorn the couple's home or bedchamber with floral arrangements, creating a fragrant symbolic barrier against bad luck. The scents of lavender, rosemary, and sage were not only pleasant, they were thought to protect the household from disease and evil influences, particularly in times of plague or famine. Certain days were considered luckier than others. Astrological readings sometimes guided wedding dates, particularly among nobility who could afford astrologers. Superstitious calendars dictated that specific months or feast days were more auspicious. For example, May was traditionally associated with fertility and growth, while certain saints' days might provide divine favor. Peasant communities often relied on local wisdom and oral tradition, selecting days based on the cycles of the moon, planting seasons, or harvest times. Timing mattered because a wedding was not merely symbolic. It had practical consequences for family planning, work schedules, and agricultural labor. Bells played a particularly intriguing role. Ringing bells at a wedding, whether in the church or the village, served a dual purpose. First, they announced the union to the community, a practical function, signaling that two households were now joined. Second, they were believed to repel evil spirits and malicious forces. Noise, in many cultures, was considered protective. The louder and more sustained the ringing, the stronger the spiritual safeguard. Some villages even had specific wedding bells, rung exclusively for marital ceremonies. Objects and charms added yet another layer of ritual. Small tokens, rings, charms, amulets, or coins were sometimes incorporated into clothing or hidden in bedchambers. These objects functioned as talismans against misfortune or infertility, even in elite households. Medieval brides might carry a small charm sewn into her gown or a coin placed under the pillow, bridging folk practice and personal belief. Food itself could become symbolic. In some regions, a ceremonial loaf of bread was broken and shared among guests to encourage unity, prosperity, and fertility. Ale or wine might be blessed or passed in ritual fashion before consumption. Roasted meats could carry symbolic significance. A whole bird, such as a goose or chicken, represented abundance and continuity. The communal act of eating was not only celebratory, but also ritualistic, embodying shared prosperity. Customs around clothing and presentation also reflected superstition. Brides might include certain colored ribbons, flowers, or even small charms in their dress, believing that these would bring luck. Veils were more than modesty. They protected the bride from envy or ill will, particularly from women in the community who might harbor jealousy. For grooms, ceremonial belts or swords were sometimes marked with symbols or blessings to ensure protection of the household. Even gestures and physical movements carried meaning. Circling the church before entering, walking under a symbolic arch, or holding hands in particular ways were believed to confer blessings. Touching certain objects like a church font or a holy relic might be incorporated before or after the ceremony to guarantee favor or fertility. These customs, while varying by region, reflected a shared understanding. Marriage was more than legality or religious ritual. It was a liminal act, transitioning the couple into a new social, economic, and spiritual status, fraught with uncertainty. Perhaps most fascinating, many of these superstitions coexisted seamlessly with church oversight. The clergy often tolerated or subtly incorporated folk practices, recognizing that rituals, charms, and celebrations were important to communities. Bells, bread, and music could carry dual meaning, both sacred and protective. A priest might bless the couple, while neighbors tossed grains or herbs, integrating social, legal, and folk traditions in a single ceremony. The layering of superstition also helped cope with the unpredictability of medieval life. Plagues, famine, and sudden death were common realities. Marriages were crucial for survival, legally, economically, and socially. Folk rituals offered a sense of control in a world where so much was uncertain. They provided reassurance that the household would endure, children would be born, and the couple would prosper. Superstition extended even beyond the day itself. Certain objects or practices remained in the household long after the ceremony. Charms might be kept for the first year of marriage, or specific foods might be prepared to guarantee continued fertility. Rituals might be repeated annually or during significant family events. Weddings were the beginning of a household, but superstition infused the early life of the family with protection and hope. Despite the mystical elements, these rituals were grounded in communal reality. Every charm, every grain, every floral wreath was observed publicly, reinforcing the union's legitimacy. Folk customs, like the formal ceremony and bedding rituals, were as much about signaling consent and property transfer as they were about spiritual or magical protection. In some, medieval weddings blended multiple layers: church law, legal recognition, social hierarchy, practical survival, and superstition. Folk rituals reminded the community and the couple that marriage was not only an agreement of households, but also an intersection of fate, fortune, and divine favor. The rituals may seem quaint or curious today, but in a world filled with uncertainty, they were profoundly meaningful. By combining superstition with structured ceremony, medieval weddings became events that bound communities together. The tossing of grains, the ringing of bells, the weaving of floral garlands, all of these acts symbolized hope, protection, and continuity. They served as a bridge between past, present, and future, honoring ancestors, witnessing the couple, and securing the household for generations to come. Once the ceremony ended, the feasting was done, and the symbolic bedding ritual had been completed. The medieval bride faced the reality that the wedding was not the climax of her life story, was the beginning of a new chapter. For women in the Middle Ages, Marriage was a transition from one household to another, and with it came responsibilities, rights, and duties that defined daily life for the decades to come. Marriage, particularly among the nobility, elevated a woman to a position of authority within the household. She often became responsible for managing servants, overseeing the preparation and storage of food, and ensuring that domestic labor ran smoothly in smaller households or among peasants. These responsibilities could include more direct work, cooking, cleaning, tending livestock, and assisting in agricultural tasks. Even so, the principle remained. The household was her domain, and her skill in managing it directly reflected on her social standing. Noblewomen were also tasked with economic oversight. They managed dowries, controlled access to valuable goods, and ensured that household resources were allocated efficiently. In larger estates, a lady might supervise dozens of servants, coordinating kitchens, laundries, and storerooms. Her authority over the household was real, tangible, and necessary for the smooth operation of a noble estate. Failure to maintain order could create tension with the husband's family, undermine the household's reputation, or even threaten the well-being of dependents. Among commoners, women faced a different but equally demanding reality. Peasant brides entered households that were already hubs of labor, often participating in planting, harvesting, and tending livestock. The line between ceremonial celebration and practical labor blurred quickly, where a noble bride's authority was exercised through delegation and oversight. A peasant bride's authority was demonstrated through skill and diligence. Yet in both cases, the marriage marked the start of a new social and economic role. Education for women varied widely. Noblewomen often learned reading, writing, and accounting skills necessary to manage estates. They were familiar with ledgers, dowry agreements, and sometimes even legal matters related to inheritance. Some might supervise apprentices or scribes to maintain records of land, livestock, and transactions. Peasant women were typically illiterate, but their education was practical: spinning, weaving, cooking, and animal husbandry. These skills ensured household survival and social recognition within the village. Childbearing was, of course, central to the medieval understanding of marriage. Fertility was expected, and producing heirs, particularly sons, was vital for inheritance, family continuity, and political alliances. Noblewomen might bear children under considerable pressure, with medical care rudimentary at best. Peasant women faced similar expectations, compounded by the rigors of daily labor and frequent scarcity. Yet beyond childbearing, women were often deeply involved in raising and educating children, particularly girls, in the skills and rituals of their households. Legal rights for women were complex. In many regions, a bride's dowry became her financial security, though her control over it could vary. Widows had dower rights, guaranteeing a portion of property for their maintenance if their husbands died. In some noble courts, women could inherit and administer lands directly, though these cases were exceptions rather than norms. Peasant women's rights were often customary, derived from community acknowledgement rather than codified law. Regardless of class, women's roles after marriage were a mix of domestic authority, social responsibility, and economic oversight. Social expectations reinforced these roles. Women were expected to embody modesty, piety, and diligence, while also navigating relationships with in-laws, servants, and neighbors. A bride's success was measured not just by her compliance with marital duties, but by her ability to maintain harmony, oversee production, and manage resources effectively. Humor and human interaction played a role. A well-timed jest, a shared meal, or gentle authority could smooth household tensions. The rhythm of daily life for women after marriage was structured yet dynamic. Mornings might begin with checking stored provisions, preparing bread, or organizing servants. Midday could involve overseeing agricultural work, supervising laborers, or tending gardens. Evenings were spent ensuring that children were fed, the household was tidy, and the family's obligations were met. Noblewomen had more delegation, but the oversight responsibilities were equally taxing. Religion remained integral to a married woman's life. She maintained prayers, observed saints' days, and ensured that family rituals were respected. Church attendance was often required, and participation in local religious festivals reinforced her household's social presence. Some women also engaged in charitable works, supporting local communities or religious institutions, further expanding their influence beyond the home. Peasant women, while less formally powerful, held a different but equally important influence. They ensured survival, continuity, and social cohesion in a village setting. Their daily labor underpinned the economy and stability of the household, and their participation in communal life reinforced the social web that defined rural medieval society. Interestingly, the transition into married life could also be psychologically complex. Leaving one household for another required adjustment. The bride moved from daughter to wife, from childhood networks to adult responsibility. Relationships with husbands, in-laws, and servants demanded negotiation, tact, and diplomacy. While love could exist, the medieval framework emphasized duty, cooperation, and social cohesion above personal desire. Among elite women, influence could extend further. Noble women could act as mediators in disputes, manage legal affairs in their husband's absence, and even oversee military preparations if estates were threatened. Some became patrons of art or architecture, reinforcing their family's status and creating lasting legacies. The household was both home and administrative hub, and women were central to its function. Cultural practices reinforced these roles. Clothing after the wedding signified status and role. A bride's daily attire reflected her position, practical for labor, ceremonial for public events, and adorned with subtle symbols of her household's prestige. Jewelry, veils, and functional tools marked authority, identity, and connection to her family and husband. Even food preparation carried symbolic weight. Peasant women often baked bread for communal consumption, reflecting household skill and reinforcing social bonds. Noble women might oversee banquets, ensuring that guests were properly served, that seating followed hierarchy, and that the household's reputation was displayed through culinary excellence. In both cases, food was both sustenance and social statement. The long-term impact of marriage on women's lives was profound. The household became a central unit of identity. Daily routines, social interactions, and economic management revolved around the married status. Fertility, labor, authority, and religious observance were intertwined. The wedding was not an isolated celebration, but the threshold into a life structured around duty, family, and social order. Yet within this structure, there was room for creativity, strategy, and personal expression. Women could influence household decisions, participate in local politics, educate children, manage resources, and maintain social networks. Their role was indispensable, though often underrepresented in historical narratives focused on male authority. In summary, the role of women after the wedding was multifaceted. Household management, overseeing servants, food, and daily operations. Economic oversight, managing dowries, resources, and property were applicable. Childbearing and education, ensuring heirs and instructing the next generation. Social navigation, mediating relationships within the household and village. Religious participation, maintaining ritual, prayer, and spiritual obligations. Whether noble or peasant, the medieval bride stepped into a world where competence, diligence, and authority were required. Marriage was not a romantic pinnacle, it was the beginning of adult responsibility, a system of labor, authority, and survival. The wedding may have been celebrated with ceremony, feasting, and ritual, but the true work began the morning after, in the quiet, structured rhythms of daily life. The medieval bride's world was one of purpose, ritual, and endurance. She balanced duty, family, and personal identity in ways that defined not just her life, but the stability of her household and the continuity of her lineage. Her role was demanding, structured, and socially vital, a responsibility she assumed with care, skill, and often remarkable resilience. If the wedding marked the beginning of a woman's structured responsibilities, for men it represented a transition into authority, duty, and long-term obligations. The groom, once a son or heir in training, became the head of his household, whether a modest peasant farm or a sprawling noble estate, and his role shaped not just his own life, but the security and continuity of multiple families and social networks. Authority and legal responsibilities. The first and most immediate shift was legal and social authority. In the eyes of the law, the husband became the primary representative of the household. He was responsible for property, land management, and economic stability. In noble households, this included overseeing multiple estates, tenants, and resources. For peasant men, authority was exercised more directly, planting crops, tending livestock, repairing structures, and coordinating labor with family members. Control over property and finances was paramount. Medieval law recognized the husband as the legal guardian of family assets, though the wife often retained rights to her dowry or dower. The husband had to ensure that land leases were honored, taxes and tithes paid, and that household resources were used efficiently. Poor management could lead to debt, social disapproval, or even legal disputes. Authority was both power and responsibility, economic duty and labor. A man's daily work was often labor-intensive. For peasants, this meant physical work in the fields, tending animals, repairing tools, and ensuring harvests were sufficient for survival. Seasonal rhythms dictated tasks, planting in spring, tending crops in summer, harvesting in autumn, and preparing for winter storage. Every decision impacted the household's food security and financial stability. Noblemen, while less physically laborious, had equally complex responsibilities. They oversaw stewards, bailiffs, and servants who managed daily operations. Noblemen had to attend courts, handle legal disputes, negotiate alliances, and occasionally travel to attend to feudal obligations. Military readiness was also a concern. In times of conflict, they might lead troops or ensure that retainers and vassals fulfilled their duties. Their work was administrative, political, and strategic, a demanding balance of management and martial readiness. Family and heirship. Producing heirs was central to a man's role. Sons ensured continuity of property, lineage, and family alliances. Daughters could be married strategically to form political or economic bonds with other families. Men were expected to provide for children materially and, where possible, educate them in the skills needed to maintain the household. In noble households, this included tutoring in literacy, etiquette, estate management, and military skills. In peasant households, it included practical knowledge, farming, animal husbandry, and craft skills. In addition to producing heirs, Men were responsible for protecting the household. This included defense against external threats, such as rival families, raiders, or lawless elements, as well as internal order. The husband enforced rules within the household, mediated conflicts among servants, and ensured that the family maintained social respectability. Authority was exercised daily, often quietly, in small decisions that cumulatively defined the household's success. Social and religious responsibilities. Men also held social duties that extended beyond the home. Feasts, markets, and local assemblies required their presence. They negotiated contracts, alliances, and labor arrangements with neighbors and tenants. For noblemen, political gatherings, council meetings, or military levies added another layer of expectation. Failure to participate could undermine influence, alliances, or even safety. Religious life was equally important. Men were expected to attend church services, support charitable works, and maintain moral conduct. Weddings themselves reinforced the connection between household and parish, but continued observance of religious obligations was essential to secure divine favor, social legitimacy, and personal reputation. For noblemen, this might extend to funding chapels or supporting clergy. For peasants, participating in community rites and maintaining household prayer practices was standard. Daily household management. A man's role also included oversight of day-to-day household function. Even if he did not cook, clean, or sew, he ensured that those tasks were completed efficiently. In noble estates, this meant supervising stewards, kitchens, and workshops. In peasant households, the man often worked alongside his wife, performing complementary labor. Together, husband and wife maintained the household, one managing labor, finances, and external affairs, the other overseeing domestic operations, food production, and social responsibilities. Coordination between spouses was crucial. While men had authority in legal and social terms, a successful household depended on the combined labor, skill, and judgment of both partners. The medieval marriage was a partnership in survival, labor, and social continuity, even if modern ideas of romantic equality were absent. Military and feudal obligations. For men of rank, additional duties included military service. Noblemen were bound by feudal contracts to provide troops or serve in the lord's campaigns. This extended to training younger men in the household or managing retainers. Military readiness was not symbolic. It was a requirement to maintain status, protect land, and honor obligations. Peasant men, while less involved in organized combat, still needed to defend property, assist in community defense, or participate in local militias. Even small households required strategic thinking. Protecting crops, livestock, and stored food involved foresight. Men needed to anticipate risks, theft, bad weather, or disease. Authority, labor, and vigilance combined to safeguard both household survival and social standing. Marriage as social contract. Men's responsibilities after marriage were intertwined with social expectations. Nobility were often judged on their ability to maintain and expand influence, while peasants were judged on their reliability and contribution to the village economy. A man's reputation was connected to the household's stability, the productivity of labor, and the security of dependence. Failing in any of these areas could have social, legal, or even physical consequences. Marriage reinforced social hierarchies. Men represented the household in public affairs and legal matters, while women managed the domestic sphere. Both roles were essential, complementary, and socially sanctioned. The division of labor was practical, reflecting both necessity and custom. transitioned into lifelong duties. From the day after the wedding, a man's life was structured around duty, responsibility, and authority. Leisure was limited and often tied to social obligations, religious observances, or strategic alliances. Celebratory moments from the feast faded quickly into routine, responsibility, and planning for future survival. Despite the pressures, men found avenues for expression. Hunting, tournaments, craftwork, and patronage allowed noblemen to exercise skill, demonstrate prestige, and reinforce networks. Peasant men found pride and satisfaction in successful harvests, thriving livestock, and respected participation in the community. In both cases, competence defined reputation and long-term security. The balance of household power. The medieval household functioned as a system of checks and balances. Men provided authority, legal oversight, and protection. Women managed resources, domestic labor, and social cohesion. Children and servants participated in sustaining this structure. While men wielded formal power, effective households relied on cooperation, skill, and mutual recognition of roles. Even humor and small gestures played a role. Shared meals, storytelling, festive events, and ritual observances reinforced bonds within the household. Social cohesion, trust, and shared effort were as essential as legal authority or physical labor. Medieval men assumed a role that combined leadership, labor, and protection. Authority was balanced by responsibility, and power was inseparable from duty. While women managed the domestic and economic sphere, men carried the household's legal, social, and external obligations. Together, these roles ensured the household functioned, survived, and thrived. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not a romantic culmination. It was a structured, multifaceted system, a partnership of labor, authority, and continuity. For men, the wedding marked the beginning of lifelong obligations to family, community, and lineage, shaping daily routines, social standing, and economic responsibility. The feast, ceremony, and bedding rituals were just the prelude. The real story unfolded in the decades that followed, as husbands and wives navigated the practical, social, and symbolic landscape of married life. Life in the Middle Ages was rarely calm, and weddings were no exception. While a marriage was always a social, legal, and spiritual contract, it also had to contend with the unpredictability of the world wars. Plagues, famine, and economic instability could transform what was meant to be a joyous occasion into a hastily arranged, deeply pragmatic event. The ceremony, feast, and rituals often adapted to circumstance, revealing the resilience, creativity, and pragmatism of medieval communities. Weddings during war. Conflict was a near constant reality in medieval Europe, whether between kingdoms, duchies, or local feuding families. Marriages were often timed or accelerated to strengthen alliances or protect property. A bride might be married at short notice to secure loyalty between two noble houses or cement a truce. Dowries and land transfers became critical tools in negotiations. In noble households, these weddings retained ceremonial elements, though the scale could be reduced. A cathedral or chapel might host the service, but the extended feast could be shortened or simplified due to the dangers of travel or the need for men to return to military obligations. Feasts might focus on durable foods like bread, salted meat, and wine, rather than elaborate multiple courses. Entertainment could be limited to music or a few dances, as resources and attention were directed toward defense and strategic concerns. Peasant weddings were similarly affected. Conscription of men or raiding of villages could disrupt local schedules, forcing couples to marry quickly when stability allowed. Community feasts might be minimal, with neighbors contributing what they could spare. The ceremony itself remained vital, as legal recognition ensured property rights, inheritance, and social protection even amidst turmoil. During prolonged conflicts, weddings could also serve as morale boosters or symbolic assertions of resilience. A noble wedding during wartime could signal that life, alliances, and family continuity endured despite the chaos outside the castle walls. In villages, marriages affirmed that the social fabric, the network of families and households, remained intact, sustaining hope for the future. Weddings during plague. Plague had a dramatic impact on medieval life. Most famously, the Black Death of the 14th century, which decimated populations across Europe. Weddings during such crises were often subdued or dramatically altered. Fear of contagion restricted travel and large gatherings, and social rituals were curtailed for health and safety. Despite the risks, marriage remained crucial. The sudden loss of spouses, children, or family members created practical urgency. Households needed continuity, heirs had to be secured, and property rights formalized. Families sometimes arranged marriages hastily to stabilize estates, protect inheritances, or ensure economic survival. Ceremonies during plague could be small, limited to immediate family, witnesses, and a priest. Feasts were abbreviated or omitted. Rituals like the bedding ceremony or elaborate blessings might be performed privately or postponed. Even so, the legal and symbolic elements, consent, witnesses, and church blessing, were retained wherever possible, reflecting the resilience of social and religious norms even in extreme circumstances. Folk rituals became especially important during plague. Protective charms, herbs, and small tokens were employed to ward off disease and misfortune. Bells were rung, even in empty streets, to maintain tradition and assert spiritual protection. Superstition and ritual provided a sense of control in a world suddenly dominated by death and uncertainty. Weddings during famine. Famine added yet another layer of complexity. In years of poor harvests, food shortages, or economic collapse, weddings had to adapt to scarce resources. Peasant families might simplify ceremonies, limit feasts to what was strictly available, or postponed weddings until conditions improved. Even small feasts were symbolic. Bread, cheese, and whatever preserved meats could be spared were enough to mark the occasion and secure social recognition. For noble families, famine could mean adjusting lavish displays. Exotic or imported foods were often omitted. Banquets focused on sustenance over spectacle, while ceremonies and dowries might be simplified or delayed. Nevertheless, marriages remained a priority, particularly for strategic reasons. Maintaining alliances, securing heirs, and demonstrating household resilience were essential, even in lean years. Adaptation and resilience. What becomes clear when examining weddings during crises is how adaptable medieval marriage practices were. Ceremony and ritual could be scaled up or down, feasts simplified, and gatherings limited without undermining the social, legal, or religious functions of marriage. Consent, witnesses, and church oversight remained central, providing continuity in a world where external circumstances were often chaotic. Community involvement also demonstrated resilience. Villagers, neighbors, or servants might step in to support a wedding despite shortages, providing labor, small gifts, or symbolic participation. In noble households, retainers and family networks adapted quickly to ensure that ceremonies proceeded, even if on a compressed timeline. Weddings thus became markers of continuity and stability, asserting that life would go on despite famine, war, or plague. Social implications. Weddings under duress also highlight the interplay between social obligation and personal experience. Marriages arranged quickly to secure alliances, inheritances, or household survival could feel rushed, but they reinforced the social structure and legal norms. The couple's personal desires, while sometimes secondary, were acknowledged within a framework of necessity. Humor, small gestures of affection, and shared responsibility provided humanity amidst pressure. In crises, the symbolic aspects of weddings often gained added weight. Bells ringing, grains thrown, blessings performed, and rituals observed carried heightened significance. They were acts of defiance against misfortune, affirmations of hope, and practical assertions of household continuity. Even modest ceremonies conveyed a message. Families endured, households persisted, and society continued to function. Examples from history. Historical chronicles offer glimpses of weddings during difficult times. During the Black Death in England, some noble families arranged marriages in weeks rather than months, securing dowries and alliances before illness could claim heirs. Peasant chronicles from France recount small village weddings where the community pooled resources to celebrate, even when food was scarce. In Germany, marriages were sometimes synchronized with harvest cycles, ensuring that celebrations were possible even amidst broader hardship. Weddings in times of war, plague, or famine remind us that marriage was not only a personal or romantic milestone, it was a pragmatic institution designed to adapt, survive, and maintain social and legal continuity. The rituals, however modest, were a bridge between tradition, necessity, and hope. The balance between ceremony and survival. Even under extreme conditions, medieval weddings balanced ceremony and survival. Legal recognition, church blessing, and consent ensured continuity. Folk rituals, feasts, and symbolic gestures maintained social cohesion. The household's practical needs dictated adaptation, but the core principles, legitimacy, union, and community acknowledgement, remained intact. The resilience of medieval marriage practices reveals a sophisticated understanding of human needs and social structures. Weddings were not frivolous celebrations. They were essential mechanisms for survival, alliance, and social continuity. They were flexible enough to endure war, plague, and famine while retaining their cultural, legal, and spiritual significance. In conclusion, crises amplified the practical and symbolic dimensions of medieval weddings. They highlighted the adaptability of communities, the importance of legal and religious structures, and the enduring human desire to assert continuity and hope. A wedding was always a household's future in miniature, fragile, vulnerable, yet remarkably resilient. And there you have it. Medieval weddings were far more complex, colorful, and sometimes surprising than the fairy tales would have us believe. Behind the stone churches and candlelit feasts were real people navigating family expectations, financial realities, community traditions, and occasionally, genuine love. Some celebrations lasted for days with music, dancing, and endless food, while others were simple vows spoken at a church door, witnessed by only a few neighbors. It's a reminder that history isn't just about battles and kings. It's about everyday moments, too. And few moments were more important in medieval life than a wedding day. What surprised you the most? The traditions, the clothing, the role of family arrangements. Let me know in the comments. I always love hearing which details stood out to you. If you enjoyed stepping back in time with us, please like this video. It truly helps the channel grow and allows more people to discover these hidden slices of history. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next journey into the past. When you're ready for another story, check out the related videos on your screen. Whether it's medieval daily life, the real lives of monarchs, or customs that shaped entire societies, there's always more to uncover. Until next time, thank you for spending a little piece of history with me. I'll see you in the next chapter.